What if I told you that the most important punch Michael Jordan ever threw was not in a game? What if the moment that truly unlocked the greatest dynasty in NBA history happened not under the lights of the United Center, not in front of millions of fans around the world, but inside a closed gym during a practice nobody was supposed to talk about, and it ended with Jordan's fist connecting with the face of one of his own teammates? And what if the man on the receiving end of that punch would later say it was the best thing that ever happened to him? Stay with that question. Let it sit for a moment, because we are going to spend the next several minutes going deep into one of the most extraordinary stories in the history of professional sports, a story about violence and accountability, about grief and resilience, about the strange and unpredictable ways that trust is built between human beings who are forced together under impossible pressure. A story that begins with a fistfight and ends with a shot that changed the course of two careers and a franchise forever. A story that, when you hear all of it, not just the highlight but all of it, will make you see Michael Jordan and Steve Kerr in a way you never quite have before. This is not a story about violence. This is not a story about a superstar out of control. This is the story of how a single moment of rage, and the phone call that came after, forged one of the most unlikely bonds in sports history, a bond that would produce a championship, a game-winning shot, and a friendship tested by something far more devastating than a black eye. But before you can understand what happened in that gym in the fall of 1995, you need to understand the weight Michael Jordan was carrying when he walked through those doors. It had been 18 months since Michael Jordan last played professional basketball. 18 months since he announced his first retirement in October 1993, in one of the most stunning press conferences the sports world had ever witnessed. He was 29 years old. He was the best player on the planet. He was at the absolute peak of his powers. And he was walking away. The official reason was that he had lost his desire to compete at the highest level of the game. But anyone who paid close attention knew the real reason was written all over his face every time someone mentioned it. His father, James Jordan, had been murdered just 2 months before, shot in his car on a North Carolina highway in the summer of 1993. The man who had been Michael's anchor, his greatest supporter, the person who had taught him to compete and never quit, was gone. For the next 18 months, Michael Jordan tried to be someone else. He laced up baseball cleats instead of basketball shoes. He reported to spring training with the Birmingham Barons, a Double-A affiliate of the Chicago White Sox, and he did exactly what nobody expected the greatest basketball player alive to do. He struggled. He hit 2-on-2. He made errors in the outfield. He endured the mockery of reporters who said he was disrespecting the sport of baseball, that his presence was a publicity stunt, that he was an athlete out of his element who should go back where he belonged. Column after column dismissed him. Late-night comedians joked about it. The whole exercise was treated, by much of the media, as an embarrassing sideshow. And through all of it, Michael Jordan kept showing up. He arrived early for batting practice. He stayed late. He took extra rounds in the cage. He asked questions. He listened. His hitting coach, Mike Barnett, would later say that Jordan was one of the most coachable athletes he had ever worked with, that the man who had famously been resistant to Phil Jackson's triangle offense and his team-first philosophy brought a student's humility to the baseball diamond that surprised everyone who expected arrogance. What people saw during those months was a man going through the motions. What was actually happening was something far more complex. Jordan was grieving. He was rebuilding. He was trying to figure out who he was without his father in the stands and without the roar of the crowd that had defined his entire adult life. Baseball, with its demands for patience, for quiet perseverance, for the ability to fail repeatedly and still step back into the box, was teaching him something that 17 years of basketball stardom had never quite managed to drill all the way in. Then the MLB players' strike hit in the spring of 1995, and Jordan walked away from baseball camp rather than cross the picket line. He was a man of principle. He had once been the Bulls' player representative. He was not going to be a replacement player. And just like that, the door to basketball swung back open. The announcement came on March 18, 1995, in a 2-word press release that sent the entire sports world into a frenzy. "I'm back." The Chicago Bulls were under $500. Scottie Pippen was demanding a trade. Phil Jackson was threatening to retire, and suddenly, without warning, the greatest player in the game was walking back onto the floor. What came next surprised nearly everyone. Jordan played 17 games to close out the regular season, struggling at times to find his rhythm, clearly rusty, his body reshaped by months of baseball conditioning. His upper body bulked up in ways that didn't quite serve a basketball player. The Bulls made the playoffs as a 6th seed, and they ran into the Orlando Magic, a young, hungry team led by Shaquille O'Neal and Anthony Hardaway. In Game 1 of the Eastern Conference semifinals, with the Bulls trailing by 1 point and Jordan at the free throw line, the unthinkable happened. Nick Anderson stole the ball from Jordan, not once, but twice, on the same possession. The Magic won. They won the series in 6 games. And Jordan, for the first time in a very long time, had lost in the first round. He sat with that pain all summer. And when training camp for the 1995-96 season opened in October, Michael Jordan walked into the Berto Center in Deerfield, Illinois, with something burning inside him that nobody who saw him that week would ever forget. Phil Jackson noticed it immediately. The Zen master, the coach who had guided Jordan to 3 consecutive championships from 1991 through 1993, who had been hired largely because he was one of the few human beings alive who could manage the force of nature that was Michael Jordan. Phil Jackson recognized what he was looking at. This was not the Jordan of the first 3-peat, the brilliant scorer who had slowly, reluctantly learned to trust his teammates. This was a man on a mission, a man with something to prove, a man who had spent almost 2 years feeling like he was not quite himself, and who had come back to basketball to reclaim everything he felt had been taken from him. Jordan pushed in practice with an intensity that bordered on terrifying. He trash-talked, he fouled, he challenged every single player on that roster, from the veterans to the rookies, testing their mettle, finding out who could handle pressure and who would fold. Former teammate Will Perdue, in interviews years later, would admit that Jordan had punched him during a practice scrimmage earlier in Jordan's career. It wasn't an isolated incident. When Michael Jordan decided someone needed to be toughened up, his methods were not always gentle, but nobody had ever quite pushed back. Not until Steve Kerr. You need to understand who Steve Kerr was in the fall of 1995, because he was one of the most unlikely figures to ever find himself in Michael Jordan's orbit. Kerr was 30 years old, 6 feet 2 inches tall on a generous day, a slim, unassuming guard who had bounced between the Phoenix Suns, the Cleveland Cavaliers, and the Orlando Magic before landing in Chicago. He was not an athlete in the traditional sense. He was a shooter, perhaps one of the most accurate 3-point shooters the league had ever seen, with a release so pure and a mind so sharp that he had already set the all-time record for single-season 3-point shooting percentage. But he was not fast. He was not explosive. He was not physically imposing in any way. When he walked into a room, you might have thought he was the assistant equipment manager. You would not have looked at him and thought, here is a man who will stand up to Michael Jordan and not flinch. What he was, however, was harder than almost anyone knew, and the hardness had been forged in fires that had nothing to do with basketball, because Steve Kerr had grown up in places most NBA players had never been. He had been born in Beirut, Lebanon, to Malcolm Kerr, an American academic who eventually became the president of the American University of Beirut, and Ann Kerr, his mother. He had spent his childhood moving between Lebanon, Egypt, and other parts of the Middle East. He had attended Cairo American College. He had learned from the earliest age what it meant to live with uncertainty, to understand that the world outside your door could become dangerous without warning, that stability was something you carried inside yourself, rather than something the world provided. He had been at the Beirut airport at age 18, in August 1983, preparing to board a flight to the United States to register for his freshman year at the University of Arizona, a school he had never visited, on a campus he had never seen, when a 122mm rocket exploded nearby. He was 18 years old. For a moment, standing in that airport, with the ceiling shaking around him, he thought it might be his last few moments on Earth. He eventually escaped the city through a harrowing overnight drive through Syria and military checkpoints, before catching a flight from Amman, Jordan to Cairo and then to the United States. He arrived in Tucson, Arizona, having survived a rocket attack and a 10-hour drive through a war zone, to play college basketball. And 4 months after he arrived, in January 1984, his father was murdered. Malcolm Kerr was shot and killed at the door of his office at the American University of Beirut by gunmen affiliated with the militant group Islamic Jihad. He was 52 years old. Steve Kerr was 18. He buried his father and returned to basketball because that was all he knew how to do. Years later, standing at a podium in Arizona before a game against rival Arizona State, he endured taunts from the student section, chants of PLO and "Where's your father?" in reference to his father's murder. He stood there, tears in his eyes, and then he went out and made all 6 of his 3-point attempts in the first half. He finished with 20 points in the first half alone, leading Arizona to victory. He did not quit. He performed. So when Michael Jordan got in Steve Kerr's face during that practice in October 1995, he was not dealing with a player who could be easily broken. He was dealing with someone who had already looked at worse and kept going. Here is what happened, reconstructed from what Jordan, Kerr and Phil Jackson would later describe in The Last Dance documentary and various interviews. Phil Jackson had put Kerr on Jordan for a scrimmage drill. Jordan was aggressive from the first possession, talking trash, pushing the pace, making the drill as physical as he possibly could. Kerr, on the opposing team in the scrimmage, was getting beaten. His side was losing badly, and Jordan was letting everyone know about it. Then Jackson started calling fouls on Jordan. Ticky-tack fouls, Jordan would later say, calls for minor contact, calls he felt were soft, calls that he believed did not reflect the kind of physical game they would face when the regular season began, and they were going to battle against the New York Knicks, the Indiana Pacers, the Orlando Magic. Jordan grew furious. In his mind, Phil was protecting Kerr. In his mind, protecting Kerr in practice was the worst possible thing you could do to him. It was setting him up to fail when the games got hard, and there was no referee in the world soft enough to call those fouls. Jordan fouled Kerr, hard, deliberately. The message was clear. I am not going to coddle you. Phil can call whatever he wants, but on this floor you are going to learn to deal with contact. Kerr, who by his own admission had a great deal of patience as a human being until he finally snapped, had been absorbing the trash talk and the physicality for the entire practice. And then something shifted. He had reached his limit. He had enough of being pushed around by the most famous player in the world in front of his teammates. He hauled off and hit Michael Jordan in the chest. The gym went absolutely silent. Nobody hit Michael Jordan, not in practice, not deliberately, not like that. For a fraction of a second, the two men looked at each other, and then Jordan did exactly what Jordan did. He reacted. He hit Kerr in the eye, not a brush, not a shove, a punch, clean and hard, that gave Steve Kerr a black eye that would still be visible the next morning. Phil Jackson threw Jordan out of practice immediately. Kerr stayed on the floor. The practice went on because in the chaos of that particular Bulls training camp, even a fistfight was not enough to shut everything down. As Will Perdue would later note, physical altercations in Bulls practice sessions were not unheard of. What made this one different was who was involved and what happened next. What happened next surprised everyone. Jordan walked to the locker room. He stood in the shower, and in the steam and the silence of that room, something clarified inside him. He had just punched a teammate. Not just any teammate. He had punched one of the smallest players on the roster, a man who by Jordan's own accounting was not even close to his physical equal. And that man had stood up to him anyway. That man had hit him back. Jordan later described it to Phil Jackson this way. I'm in the shower and I'm saying I just beat up the littlest guy on the court, and I felt about this small. There was no glory in what he had done. There was no test passed and proved. There was only the recognition that he had let his anger get away from him, and that he had hurt somebody who didn't deserve it. In Phil Jackson's book, 11 Rings, Jordan is quoted as saying that the incident made him look at himself and acknowledge, "You know what? You're really being an idiot about this whole process. I knew I had to be more respectful of my teammates." That is not the kind of self-awareness that people associate with the public image of Michael Jordan, the ruthless competitor who once said that he had earned the right to demand greatness from the people around him because he had endured things they had not. And yet in the privacy of that locker room, that was exactly who he was, A man looking in the mirror and not loving what he saw. And something else, something quieter and more important, was also beginning to form in Jordan's mind. A grudging, almost unwilling respect, because Steve Kerr had not backed down. Steve Kerr had hit him back. That was not something Jordan had encountered very often, and it registered in a place that went deeper than competitive calculation. Jordan tested everyone who played with him. He pushed, and most people bent, and that told him something about them that he filed away. Useful information about how much he could trust them when the game was on the line, and the pressure was the kind that broke people. But Kerr had not bent. Kerr had pushed back. And that told Jordan something entirely different. Jordan left the Berto Center, drove toward home, and then he turned around. He went back to the gym, found a staff member, and asked for Steve Kerr's phone number. He called Kerr that same afternoon. The conversation was short by all accounts. Jordan apologized. He told Kerr the fight had nothing to do with him personally. It was about Jordan's own frustration, about Phil calling those fouls, about the fire that had been building in him since the moment Nick Anderson stole that ball in Orlando. Kerr accepted the apology, and then Kerr said something, or perhaps it was the simple act of picking up the phone at all, that completed something that had started in that practice gym. Kerr, speaking later about the incident, said, "We talked it out, and it was probably, in a weird way, the best thing that I ever did was stand up for myself with him, because he tested everybody he played with, and I stood up to him. From that point on, our relationship dramatically improved, and our trust in each other, everything. It was like, all right, we got that out of the way, we're going to war together." Going to war together, that is a phrase worth sitting with, because that is exactly what they did, because in the weeks and months that followed that practice, something in the relationship between Michael Jordan and Steve Kerr began to change. Jordan started watching Kerr differently. Not with the contempt that a superstar reserves for the player he views as merely a role filler, someone to be used and discarded when his 3 minutes of action each quarter were done. He started watching Kerr with something that looked a great deal like attention. He noticed how Kerr prepared, the repetition, the stillness, the way he moved through every drill with a focus that was quiet rather than loud, methodical rather than explosive. He noticed how Kerr handled adversity on the floor, not with ego, not with posturing, but with quiet, efficient execution. He noticed that Kerr, despite having no business being on the same court as the greatest player alive by any physical measure, was never rattled. He was beginning to see for the first time what Kerr actually was. And Kerr, for his part, was beginning to understand Jordan. He had seen up close what drove the man. He had felt the force of that competitive fire directly. He had the bruise to prove it. And now he had heard the voice on the other end of the phone, raw and honest, admitting fault in a way that almost no one in Jordan's position would have done. Jordan was not just a force of destruction. He was also a man capable of accountability, of regret, of reaching out across the silence to say he was wrong. Kerr had dealt with powerful people all his life. He had grown up around diplomats and academics, people whose authority was total within their spheres, and who did not often apologize. Jordan's phone call meant something. It landed differently than Kerr might have expected. It told him that underneath all the fury and the dominance and the relentless testing, there was a human being he could actually work with. That phone call changed everything, not overnight, and not in any dramatic single moment, but gradually, the way real trust always builds, through consistency, through repeated small choices, through the accumulation of evidence that the person across from you will act with integrity even when it costs them something. The 1995-96 Chicago Bulls went on to accomplish something that had never been done before in professional basketball. They won 72 games in the regular season, a record that stood for 20 years and was widely considered the single greatest achievement in NBA regular season history. They were not merely dominant, they were relentless, they were precise. They were a team in which every player, from Scottie Pippen to Dennis Rodman to Tony Kukoc, knew his role and executed it without complaint. Steve Kerr averaged 8 points a game. He shot over 45% from three. He was a weapon in the triangle offense, a chess piece that Jordan and the rest of the team used to devastating effect, because when defenses focused on stopping Michael Jordan, Steve Kerr was always somewhere on the floor, perfectly still, perfectly calm, waiting for the moment that the ball would find him. They won the championship that June, beating the Seattle Supersonics in 6 games. It was Jordan's 4th title, it was Kerr's first. And as they celebrated on the floor, nobody who saw them together would have guessed that just 8 months earlier they had been standing in a practice gym throwing punches at each other. But the story was not finished. Not yet. The most important chapter was still to come. The 1996-97 season brought the Bulls back to the top of the Eastern Conference, and for the 2nd consecutive year, they advanced to the NBA Finals, this time against the Utah Jazz, the methodical, brilliant team built around Karl Malone and John Stockton, coached by the legendary Jerry Sloan. The series went 6 games. Going into Game 6 at the United Center in Chicago, the Bulls led 3 games to 2. They needed one more win to clinch the championship on their home floor. Game 6 was tight throughout. The Jazz were well coached, well prepared, and willing to sacrifice everything to deny Jordan his moment. With the game tied at 86 and the Bulls in possession of the ball, roughly 28 seconds remained on the clock. The entire building knew what was about to happen. Phil Jackson called timeout. In the huddle, he drew up the final play. Everyone assumed the ball would end up in Jordan's hands for the last shot. That was how the world worked. That was how it had always worked with the Bulls. Michael Jordan took the last shot, made or missed, and the championship swung on the outcome. But Jordan had been watching. He had been thinking. Earlier in the series, during a road game in Utah, Stockton had left Kerr to double-team Jordan, and the result had been a disaster. Stockton stole the ball and converted for the Jazz. Jordan filed that moment away. In his mind, that series of events was going to happen again. In the huddle, Jordan turned to Kerr. The room was loud. Adrenaline was flooding through every body in that timeout circle. Jordan looked at his teammate, the man he had punched in the eye less than 2 years before, the man who had stood up to him, the man who had answered his phone call and turned a moment of ugliness into something else entirely. And Jordan said, "Don't be shocked if I find you open. You take that shot." Kerr later described his reaction with characteristic honesty. His first thought, he admitted with a grin, was something that cannot be repeated in polite company. His second thought was a statement he had made to himself in the huddle. "I'll be ready. I'll knock it down." The play unfolded almost exactly as Jordan had predicted. He caught the ball on the left wing, drove toward the basket, and drew the double team he had anticipated. Byron Russell on him, Stockton coming over to help. Jordan pump-faked, stepped through, and found Kerr at the top of the key, completely unguarded, 17 feet from the basket, with the 1997 NBA championship hanging in the balance. What happened in the next fraction of a second was the product of everything that had come before it. Every hour Steve Kerr had spent in gyms, perfecting a release so pure that coaches from college through the pros had described it as one of the finest in the history of the sport. Every moment of adversity he had absorbed, from a rocket-scarred airport in Beirut to a father who never came home, to taunts from rival student sections, to a punch from the greatest player who ever lived. All of it had been quietly building a man who did not flinch. He caught the pass, he set his feet, he fired. The ball arced through the air above a silent, breathless United Center and swished through the net with a sound that Steve Kerr would later say he could still hear in his sleep. Bulls 88, Jazz 86. 5 seconds left. The Jazz never scored again. In the locker room afterward, in the chaos and the champagne and the shouts of men who had just won a championship, Jordan found Kerr. He grabbed him, looked at him, and said something that Kerr has carried with him ever since. "Steve Kerr earned his wings tonight because I had faith in him, and I passed him the ball, and he knocked the shot down." The man Jordan had punched in the eye in October 1995 had just hit the game-winning shot in the NBA Finals. That was the twist nobody had written in any script. That was the ending that nobody predicted when the story began in a practice gym with a black eye and a broken moment between two men who barely knew each other. But there is one more layer to this story, one final dimension that very few people know, and which makes the bond between these two men something far more profound than a basketball relationship. Something that was never discussed between them, but which connected them in a way that went far deeper than 3-point percentages and championship rings. Both Michael Jordan and Steve Kerr had watched their fathers be taken from them by violence. James Jordan, Michael's father, was murdered in July 1993, shot in his car on a highway in North Carolina while he was sleeping. He was 56 years old. The killing shattered Michael Jordan. It is widely believed to have been the primary reason for his first retirement, though Jordan has never said so directly. His father had been the one constant in his life, the man who supported him when he was cut from his high school team, the man who showed up at every game, the man who was there through all of it. And then suddenly, violently, he was not. Malcolm Kerr, Steve's father, had been murdered 9 years earlier, in January 1984, in Beirut, Lebanon, shot at the door of his office. Steve Kerr was 18 years old. In The Last Dance documentary, Kerr was asked directly whether he and Jordan had ever talked about what they shared. Two men who had lost their fathers to murder, two men who knew what it was like to have that particular kind of grief follow you onto every court, into every locker room, through every moment of public triumph and private struggle. Kerr's answer was quiet and immediate. "We never discussed that," he said. "I think it was probably too painful for each of us." Think about that for a moment. These two men, who had fought each other in practice, who had reconciled over the phone, who had built one of the most improbable partnerships in the history of sport, who had won championships together, who had shared the most extreme highs and lows that professional basketball could offer, had looked at each other across all of those years and all of those shared victories, and they had never once said out loud the thing that bound them together at the deepest level. The grief was too large, the loss was too raw. Some wounds are carried quietly, not because they have healed, but because some things are beyond the reach of words. What does this story mean? It means that the greatest competition is never really against the opponent across from you. It is against the version of yourself that wants to quit, that wants to fold, that wants to walk away when the circumstances get painful enough. Steve Kerr could have backed down from Jordan in that practice. He could have absorbed the physical punishment and the trash talk and kept his head down and survived. That is what most people would have done in his position. Instead, he pushed back. Not because he thought he could beat Michael Jordan in a fistfight, but because something in him refused to be diminished. Because standing up for yourself, even at cost, is sometimes the only way to be seen. Jordan, for his part, could have done what powerful people often do when they lose control. He could have deflected, minimized, told himself the smaller man had it coming. Instead, he drove back to that gym. He found a phone number. He made the call. And in doing so, he demonstrated something that his competitive ferocity had sometimes obscured, that the man behind the legend was capable of accountability in ways that mattered. Think about the people in your own life who have challenged you. The ones who pushed back when you pushed first. The ones who didn't let you off the hook, who forced you to reckon with something uncomfortable about yourself. They were not your enemies. They were often the people who ended up earning your deepest trust. Because trust is not built in comfort. It is built in friction, in conflict, in the moment when someone refuses to become small just because you are large. That is what Steve Kerr did for Michael Jordan, and that is why when the most important moment of the 1997 NBA Finals arrived, with the championship on the line, with everyone in that building expecting the ball to go to the greatest player alive, Jordan made the most radical and honest choice available to him. He passed it to the man he trusted most, not the fastest player, not the most famous player, the player who had earned his trust by standing up to him when nobody else dared. The game-winning shot that Steve Kerr hit that June evening in Chicago did not just win a championship. It changed his life in ways that are still unfolding. He was a free agent shortly after, and the San Antonio Spurs offered him a 5-year deal, the most lucrative contract of his career. He bought a house in San Diego. He provided for his family. He won 2 more championships with the Spurs. When his playing career ended in 2003, he moved into television broadcasting, and the name Steve Kerr was recognized across the entire country, not just by basketball obsessives, but by everyone who had watched him sink that shot in '97. In 2014, he became the head coach of the Golden State Warriors and led that franchise to 4 NBA titles, making him one of the most successful coaches in league history. All of it, every single branch of that tree, traces back to a timeout in Game 6 of the 1997 Finals. And that timeout traces back to a trust that was built over 2 years of working side by side with a man who had once punched him. And that trust traces back to a phone call made by a man who stood in his shower, feeling small, and decided to do the right thing. Somewhere in that chain of cause and effect is a lesson that has nothing to do with basketball. The next time you are in conflict with someone, not an enemy but a colleague, a teammate, someone you are building something with, ask yourself what is really happening. Ask yourself whether the friction between you is destroying something or forging something. Ask yourself whether the person on the other side of that argument, that fight, that difficult conversation, might turn out to be the one you trust most when the game is on the line. And if you are the one who made the mistake, do what Jordan did. Don't wait. Don't minimize. Go back. Get the number. Make the call. Because the most important thing about the story of Michael Jordan and Steve Kerr is not the punch. It is what came after the punch. It is the accountability and the reconciliation and the slow, genuine respect that grew up out of the wreckage of that moment and carried two men all the way to a championship and beyond. If this story got to you, if you felt something watching these two men find their way to each other through all the noise and fire of one of the greatest dynasties in sports, then leave a comment below. Tell us what moment in your life required you to go back and make the call. Tell us who in your story was the person you had to earn trust with the hard way. We read every single comment. And if you want to keep going deeper into the real stories behind Michael Jordan's career, the conflicts, the rivalries, the moments that defined a legend, make sure you are subscribed to this channel. Because the story of Michael Jordan is not just the story of the greatest basketball player who ever lived. It is the story of a human being, complicated and brilliant and flawed, who kept finding ways to become more than what he was. And we are just getting started.